Azure Synapse is a highly used application in all the data pipelines as soon as you have Azure, as soon as you're using Azure. What you can do with Azure Synapse is basically you can run, monitor, and restart so-called Synapse pipelines. A Synapse pipeline, what can it be? It's basically, it can do machine learning calculations on your data, can transform your data, can analyze your data, all with these within a so-called data pipeline, which starts inside notebooks, which contain the codes to manipulate your data. What we can do with our universal task for Azure Synapse, you will see in a minute. But before this, let me explain you how Azure Synapse is integrated in the blueprint from Microsoft for data pipeline. So this is what you see here is the data pipeline blueprint you find on the Microsoft homepages. What you see on the left is basically you're extracting the data from all kinds of data sources like SQL, storage tables, CosmoDB, and so on. All this extraction you can also do with our integrations. One of them is, for example, the cloud data transfer, which you will see, and the SQL task, which you will also see. Once you have ingested the data, you usually store it in some kind of data lake. In Azure, of course, this is the Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. And then you use Data Factory basically to orchestrate the movement of the data to your Azure Synapse data warehouse. So you need also the Azure Data Factory task, which is also a task you find in our integration hub. Once you've moved the data to your Azure Analytics data warehouse, it was called SQL data warehouse in the past, then you can run the Azure Synapse task to run your data pipelines, calling the different notebooks, doing the data analytics. Once you've done the analytics, then you can visualize your results in Power BI. There we have also an integration with the Power BI integration. So basically, you can do the entire workflow using Universal Automation Center. Today, I will focus on the Azure Synapse because that's the new one, and I'm going to show it to you. What you can do, especially in the Azure Synapse task, is you can run a pipeline, but you can also run a pipeline with parameters. That's important because you might want to run a pipeline with different start parameters for your notebooks. And you can provide these parameters within the task. You can list all the pipelines in the workflow, in the workspace, sorry. You can monitor the pipeline. And what's also interesting, you can also interact with a running pipeline. For example, you can cancel the pipeline, or you can also cancel it recursive. You can rerun a pipeline when it fails. So it will automatically give you the ID, and then you can rerun it with the ID. And what's also important for a lot of our customers is that we support service principle-based authentication, because that's key if you want to do automation. Okay, let me switch to Azure Synapse. Okay, so this is actually the pipeline that you just saw on the slides from Microsoft. So basically you have your input, which in this case, it's streaming data from an Azure data lake. Then you have data which comes in from a MySQL database. It's actually a database, an AWS database in the cloud. Once we have the data in our data lake, then we start Azure Data Factory that loads the data to Azure Synapse. Once I have the data in Azure Synapse, then I will run the Azure Synapse pipeline, which does some calculations and based on analytics. And finally, we visualize the data in Power BI. So today, I'm not going to show you the whole run of this pipeline. I'm going to focus on the Azure Synapse task. Let me click on the Azure Synapse task. So if you want to run a pipeline in Azure Synapse, so basically what you need to do is you need to give the connection parameters like the Azure location, the secrets, the tenant ID, and then you need to select the operation. In this case, I want to run a pipeline. You can also select others. You need to give the workspace in which your pipeline is located. And here starts already the first cool thing. We can interact dynamically with Azure Synapse. So if you click on this little magnifier here, then it shows you all the pipelines which are defined in this workspace. So you see the list box has opened and it's collected all the pipelines from the workspace. In this case, I'm using the Predict New York Taxi pipeline. This is a nice one because it's a machine learning pipeline. Just to give you what it does, it basically takes all the taxi data from the New York taxi line and then calculates the way with the highest tip you get. For this, I use all the parameters just to show it to you. So I have here the parameter file connected. So I start this with the parameter New York Taxi Blue line because the data, there's so much data from New York Taxi. I just want to get the data from the blue line. There are different taxi lines, and the blue line is the smallest actually. Yeah, then I can basically launch the task. I will launch it now from here. Normally it would be, of course, automatically launched once Azure Data Factory has loaded the data. Once it's launched, you see it's running. Now I switch to my Azure Data Factory, to my Azure Synapse, just to show you how it looks like. So I need to go to Azure Synapse. Connect. There we are. And you see it's already running. So everything worked fine. You can also see here the parameters. Remember, we put taxi blue line. So you see it has been started with the correct parameters and so on. So now what I want to show is that you can also now interact with the running pipeline. This pipeline runs very long. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cancel this pipeline. So if I see this is my Azure task. So I can now go and say cancel pipeline run or cancel pipeline recursive. In this case, I want to cancel it recursive. So with all the different notebooks which are attached. So I say submit. And if I go now back to Azure, you see cancel pipeline complete. So I've done an interaction with the pipeline and need to refresh here to see. And you see the pipeline is canceling. So while it's canceling, the task will stay in running state. So now I just need to wait until it is completely canceled here. So now it's canceled here. So this has been shown how you can interact with the Azure Synapse pipeline. What I wanted to show you just for information is actually what I'm actually starting here. So if I'm going to the integrate tab and I go to my pipeline, so it was this predict New York Taxi which I'm starting. If I'm going here, then you can see here are the defined parameters which I was setting in my task. And if I go to the settings here, then you can see this is actually the notebook which I've been starting with this pipeline. If I open this notebook, then you see it does all kinds of nice Python code here to run the analytics workflow. You see it uses all kinds here. You see the tip amount which has been calculated and so on. So to summarize, what you could do with our task is that you can run Azure Synapse pipelines, of course, and with the connected notebooks, track the status. And what you can even do is you can interact with the pipeline, you can cancel a pipeline, you can rerun a failed pipeline, and so on. Last thing what I wanted to show you is if I go to my pipeline again. Sorry, I just need to go to the pipeline again. So that's something very nice. So you see it has been failed because we say if it's canceled, we put it in status failed. But if you now go to the retrieve output, then you can see in the output, you can see everything that has been done. In this case, the last status is in this case canceled. You see status is canceled, and because we canceled this pipeline. And this status canceled is, you see it's all in JSON format. You can use also in our workflow to say, talk about the next task. And as you can say, if in this JSON text status is written canceled, then in the workflow, don't go to Power BI, but maybe go to a different task that does a rerun of this pipeline automatically. So like this, you can interact also with the result.